Hello and welcome to this Achates Inspires session on measuring and communicating your impact, and a special welcome to those who are joining us for the first time today. I'm Naomi Chapman, I'm the Deputy Director of Strategy at Achates. For those who don't know us, Achates is a leading cultural consultancy company supporting strategy at an organisational and geographical level, earned and contributed income generation, recruitment and organisational change. Achates Inspires is part of our free support to the sector, a bi-monthly event where we hear from cultural sector leaders on the issues of the day. We hope that these events give you a chance to hear experiences, ideas and approaches from outside of your organisation, giving you the tools you need to tackle common challenges through a new lens. This session will be first broadcast at 1 p.m. on the 19th of March 2026. So if you're watching live at this time, then Achates colleagues are on hand to answer any questions you have via the comments section. So do pop any questions or comments you have there. In this session, we are going to be exploring how cultural organisations can measure and communicate their impact in light of new regulations that came into place at the start of 2026 on impact reporting within our annual reports. I'm sure that this is a topic on your minds. Throughout today, when I talk about measuring impact, I mean monitoring key outputs, such as work delivered, audience numbers, evaluating the extent to which you are achieving target outcomes, changes realised or happiness being proved, for example, and learning from this insight to enhance your work. Now more than ever, it is important for the cultural sector to tell the story of its value in a big picture sense, why culture matters, what culture is for, and how culture improves lives. As a sector, we can be limited and disjointed in how we talk about our value, and that undermines our ability to influence policymakers and secure support from funders and donors. For specific organisations in the cultural sector, there is an opportunity to enhance how we measure and communicate our organisational impact. Good impact measurement starts from an understanding of what you need this insight for, whether to articulate the change you are bringing about, to track whether that change is happening, or to improve and refine your work. Not having this information can hold amazing organisations back from creating the impact they want to see with and for audiences. All of you watching today will be doing brilliant work, I'm sure, but what could you achieve with a better understanding of what works and how changes to your approach could maximise benefit? A failure to articulate and measure the impact we are seeking also leads organisations to put too much emphasis on financials. Just as all cultural charities have financial KPIs, we need to have ways of measuring the impact we create with and for audiences, and only then can we take a purpose-led approach to decision-making which considers, yes, the financial impact of decisions, but also the work we want to create and the impact that we seek. Just applying that financial lens erodes our value as purpose-led organisations and can undermine our ability to leverage impact-based philanthropy. Having good understanding of outputs, outcomes and impact can influence how we use our resources and set strategy. It also helps engage our staff and improve organisational culture, helping us to recruit, attract and retain talent. It's been fantastic to see in the recent months more impact roles being advertised in cultural charities, especially at a senior level, giving the impact we create with and for our audiences prominence in decision making alongside artistic and financial considerations. And finally, this matters because, as I've said, new SORP guidelines came into place at the start of the year that makes impact reporting a must for all charities in their accounts. The extent of this varies depending on the size of your organisation, but this move means that annual reports need to show what your charity has done, your outputs, what it has achieved, your outcomes, and what difference it has made, the impact. So the pressing question is, are you ready for this legal change? As you can probably tell, I'm really passionate about the sector improving its impact measurement practice, so I'm really looking forward to today's conversation. For anyone who may be feeling a little bit alarmed by my framing so far, I want to reassure you that I also recognise the need for impact measurement to be proportionate to our goals and resources. We're not talking about conducting a full randomised control trial for every project, just introducing easy ways of tracking outputs and outcomes that gives you the insight that you need. And we're really glad to see that this need for proportionality has now been included in evaluation guidance from the Treasury and from DCMS. At Achates, our approach is grounded in our 9 types of impact of culture and heritage framework, which has informed the universal theory of the value of culture, which is being adopted by UNESCO. Sitting beneath that framework is a pre-made outcomes framework, which we believe makes articulating and measuring the value of culture a lot easier. If you'd like to find out more about this, then do email me after today's session. Part of the challenge in impact measurement is that many of us do not feel confident in evaluation and learning practices, and often have responsibility for this as part of a fundraising, programme or engagement role. While there is a real value in specialists in this area, I want today's session to reassure you that you can put in place the fundamentals of impact measurement, whoever you are and whatever the position you hold in your organisation. I hope that as we come to conversations with our speakers, we can make this session really practical with tips for you to take forwards. And as we go into the conversation, I'll try to ask our speakers to define any specific terms they use to make this really accessible too. So that's enough from me, I think, and I'll introduce our speakers now. So to explore this topic, we're joined by Oliver Jones and Matira Wheeler. So Oliver is the director of ACTA, a community theatre in South Bristol. Having previously worked for Creativity Works, Cambridge Junction, and the Theatre Royal in Plymouth, he has a wealth of experience in driving impact with and for communities through creative learning, youth theatre, and community theatre. Hi, Oliver.
Hi there, very good to be here.
Great. And Matira is the Head of Advocacy and Policy at Sadler's Wells, a role which includes leading impact measurement practice. With previous roles across the charity sector more broadly, including at the Young Westminster Foundation and UAL, Matira brings insights in how measuring and communicating impact is distinct, or isn't, for cultural organisations. Hi, Matira.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Great. So I'm really thrilled that both Oliver and Matera have agreed to share their experience and reflections with us all as real case studies of how organisations can change their approach and the impact that can have on their development as purpose-led, resilient organisations. So, Matera and Oliver, could you start by sharing a bit of context as to where your organisation is in terms of impact measurement and the journey it's been on to get there? We'll start with Oliver and then come to you, Matera.
Great, yes, of course I can. As you mentioned, we're a community theatre based in Bedminster in South Bristol, and we work with a wide variety of diverse communities, many of whom are vulnerable and marginalised and face significant challenges in their lives and in accessing creative activity. And we co-create work with them, predominantly using theatre, but we use other art forms as well, giving them a voice so they can tell their own stories. And our journey with impact measurement has evolved significantly over time. And at the moment, we're in a real transition period. As I said, our work spans multiple communities, age groups, and art forms. And because of this breadth, measuring our impact has never been a simple one-fits-all size, one-fits-all process. Over the years, impact reporting has been largely driven by funder requirements. Like many small to mid-sized organizations, we responded to what really was being asked of us. We're an NPO, a National Portfolio Organisation, so we regularly report to Arts Council England and to Bristol City Council, as well as part of our core funding agreements. And this involves collating substantial quantitative data, participant numbers and demographics, attendance figures, engagement levels, and progression statistics as well. But that only really tells part of the story of what it is that we achieve, what we're trying to or aiming to achieve. So alongside these core requirements, we frequently have to report on different outcomes and impact measures for different communities, projects, and of course for different funders. We have a wide variety, different portfolio of different funders. So, for example, a youth theatre programme may require evidence of increased confidence and skills development. A project with older adults may focus on reducing isolation and improving well-being. Work with marginalised communities needs to demonstrate voice, representation, and social cohesion outcomes. So each funding stream brings its own framework, its own language, and its own metrics. So as a result, our impact measurement has necessarily been multifaceted, it's been adaptive and often pretty complex. So the real turning point for us, the game changer, is when we developed our own theory of change. So creating that forced us to step back and really articulate clearly what is the change that we exist to make. How do we create that change, and what are the short, medium, and long-term outcomes? So that process has given us a real shared organizational language and a structured framework to be able to map our activities to impact. So rather now than measuring simply to satisfy reporting requirements, we begin to measure against a coherent vision of change rooted in our mission and in our values. Another significant milestone as well in our journey has been recruiting a specialist impact measurement trustee onto our board. And this has really strengthened our governance and ensures that impact measurement informs decision-making rather than sitting as a sort of retrospective reporting exercise. So today we see impact measurement, not just as compliance, but as learning for the organization. So we continue to gather all of the quantitative data required by our core funders, but we also have to build in more qualitative methods, participant testimonies, case studies, reflective practice, and creative evaluation techniques to capture the real richness and the transformation that happens in our work. So our journey is really ongoing, but we now feel we have a much clearer framework, stronger governance, and real greater confidence in articulating what ACTA does and the impact it makes, not only in numbers, but in that lived experience.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Oliver. There's so much there I want to pick up on and will do in subsequent questions. I think the one thing just to reflect briefly is I love that you have a kind of impact measurement specialist trustee on your board. I think for a lot of organisations that we've been speaking to, they've seen some of these recent senior appointments of paid staff roles and thought, well, I'd love to have that, but it's just not something that we can resource. Whereas actually bringing that expertise in at a different level of leadership and making sure that case for impact being a lens for decision making in addition to artistic considerations or financial considerations is a really lovely way of doing it. So I'm sure we'll come back to that, but I just wanted to touch on that briefly. Matira, over to you.
Thank you, and echo a lot of what Oliver has said, and I think there'll be a lot of similarities. So hello everybody. As you mentioned, I'm the head of advocacy and policy at Sadler's Wells, and we create and share more dance than any other organisation in the world. As a dance charity, we work with people of all ages and all experiences. We welcome diverse audiences from around the world. We really champion and invest in dance artists and the next generation of dancers and dance talent. We engage with school children and with teachers nationwide. Last year, we worked with 30,000 people of every age in every corner of the UK. And we really create opportunities for people of all ages to come together and connect through dance to improve their health and well-being, to strengthen community understanding, to build really meaningful careers and employment, and to really help sustain our local areas as well. And we've got 4 theatres in London. We work nationally and internationally, and also through our digital stage. And my role is a new role, and I think it reflects the change and the journey that we're on as an organisation for our understanding of impact and how we can best measure that, to learn, to evaluate, to reflect, and to really strengthen the change we really want to see. So I look after the evaluation and the monitoring and reporting of all of our activities. But as you probably heard in my introduction, we do a lot. And there's a lot of teams who are working with lots of different sort of groups of people, whether that's school children, whether that's artists, whether that's communities. And to have this sort of opportunity to bring together all of those different strands of impact and evaluation that are already happening across the organisation has been a real joy. I think my role is an absolute privilege because I get to work with all the different teams and really amplify the work they're doing to drive change, to sort of drive their impact and to measure that. So I really amplify the work that's already been done, and a huge amount of work had already been done before I joined last March in sort of, as Oliver said, building that organisational approach to impact. Similarly, we're an NPO. Our funding drives and has driven a lot of our approach to the outcomes that and the outputs that we're measuring, as well as other funding as well. So I think I really echo that funding has driven our approach to date. But each individual team really responsible for that really in-depth work, whether it's with artists, audiences, and communities, has also really driven their approach and have that sort of two-way learning. So our learning engagement team have worked really closely on developing a theory of change which reflects their breadth of programme and the intent that they want to have, understanding the local kind of context and the context of groups that they're working with as well. Our artist development and programming team have similarly developed their own framework, and our marketing communications team have really developed an audience strategy. So you've got everything that our funders need everything we need to report onto the Arts Council. You've got everything that our individual teams are working on. And I think where we're at now is how we bring all of that together as an organisation to refresh the organisational logic model that we've had previously. And the working with Achates actually earlier this year has really supercharged our ability to do that. I'm sure I'll come on to it shortly, but we've been working with Caroline and with the team at Achates to really reflect and build and bring together all of those different strands of impact and evaluation that are happening across the organisation into, as Oliver said, a shared language, a shared theory of change, a shared understanding of purpose, and how we build that into, not necessarily build into because it's already there, but really strengthen that shared understanding across our organisation and governance. And I think the challenge for us with an organisation with such breadth is how this framework encompasses the breadth of work, but really also allows for really targeted evaluation that is reflective of the groups in which we're working. And lots of factors will come out during this conversation, I'm sure. The last thing I just want to note is, and again, I think it will come out shortly, is my work is this dual role, right, between impact but also policy, and how I am able to bridge some of that gap in how are we sharing our impact in a way that's best understood for different audiences to have the most impact, to build that understanding of value, as you mentioned, Naomi, of all the brilliant work that is happening across the culture sector, and how do we translate some of these messages in a way that helps all of us learn internally, but also builds our support externally.
Fantastic. Also, so much within that I want to pick up on, but as you say, we'll come on to some of the detail. I think what's really interesting, and you're working in very different contexts and in very different organisations, but I think it's really interesting that you both touched on this idea of previously your kind of impact approach being really driven by the requirements of funders, and whilst that's still obviously necessary, that both organisations have been on this shift in rooting that in a kind of organisation first, what's our shared understanding, shared language, shared framework, and then mapping that onto the expectations and needs of funders, as opposed to letting that fully dictate your approach, I think is brilliant, and great to hear you've both been on that journey. So I'm conscious that in both of your introductions, you mentioned huge kind of diversity of audiences in who you're reaching with your work, and the fact that you're doing different things for each of them, so the outcomes look quite different. I'm curious how in each of your organisations you decided which kind of types of impact to focus on, and which outputs and outcomes to measure within those. We'll start with you, Matira, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course. So we've had similar approaches that have played out for different audience groups, as you've just heard, but also that's the approach we're now taking as an organisation. And it starts with, I think, really understanding the audiences that we're working with, and really understanding those priority audiences. So whether it's our artists, whether it's our communities, whether it's our participants, whether it's colleagues, and really understanding their experience, their needs, their assets, their context, and also their barriers to engagement with us, whether it's through the National Youth Dance Company, or it's through our community dance floor activities, or it's artists taking part in artist development programs, let alone audiences and ticket bookers. So we have to understand these priority audience groups. We then need to really understand the type of impact and change that we want to support for this group. So that audience understanding is really key. And then the Achates model that we've worked with Caroline on recently has really helped us in really delving into those audience segments, and then the type of impact that we want to see for those groups, and using that process of really understanding, getting to know who we're working with and why, and really getting clear on that purpose, helps us then build an approach of a logic model for each of those audience groups, for each of our programs of change, then really building and designing the outcomes that we want to measure, and how we go about doing that. It's a real work in progress. We have multiple different frameworks at the moment that have gone through that process, and now we are working really collaboratively across departments to understand how organisationally we can also go through that similar process. And impact is all about learning, and I think that's really reflective in this being a really ongoing journey. Going through that process then enables us to have a real agreed sense of a statement of purpose and a narrative theory of change, which we can share externally and help build our support. One of the factors I think that's quite important in how we are building that sort of shared understanding and that shared framework is how we also work with organizations externally. So we've gone through that process, understanding audiences, building a sense of their need and context, building the outcomes, building the logic models. But there's also other organizations and networks we're working with externally who are doing that. So there's this balance. We're working really closely with a group of organisations at East Bank, having opened our fourth theatre, Sadler's Wells East, last year. And we have a similar framework, which is driving our approach to impact and evaluation, a shared set of outcomes. So I want to also recognise that the external environment isn't just around funders, it's also where we're working collectively. We're working collectively in a place at East Bank within the Olympic Park and the 4 Olympic boroughs. We're working collectively with dance organisations and performing arts organisations to co-create outcomes and change that we want to see. So there's a balance of when we go through that process, how we then work externally with others who've gone through that process. And I also just really, I think it's a really unique challenge for cultural organisations in when we are collectively choosing which outcomes to focus on is we've got this balance between artistic, social and economic outcomes, right? They're going to vary based on the group we're working with, the funder, the external organisation, but also how we're trying to tell a story. And we shouldn't be measuring, we can't measure everything and we shouldn't be. And so part of the process that we're doing at the moment in determining what outcomes to focus on is led by why, the audiences, what's most useful for our learning, and making sure we're not just measuring everything. We're measuring what is useful and what is supporting the relationship building with our audiences and the change that we want to see.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I love the way you kind of articulated, there's obviously this kind of audience level logic model, that kind of journey of how they go through a program and the changes that brings about for them, the kind of program level and organizational theory of change, but also not forgetting that additional level. I'm conscious I said that I wasn't going to make this sound too complicated, but I think it's really important. And we're seeing more conversations happening in the sector around that collective articulation of impact, those shared outcomes, organizations aligning their measures, because it's important, as you say, both for our individual learning and improvement of our programs and individual storytelling, but also in making that case for culture. And the more that we align as a sector and have some of those shared measures, the more that we can do that. Oliver, over to you.
Yeah, so the starting point for us really was recognizing that we were being pulled in many different directions, with different funders, different projects, different communities, all requiring different forms of reporting. So we have our funding agreements with Arts Council and Bristol City Council, which require primarily quantitative data, but at the same time, the more project-based funders often require evidence of more specific social outcomes, such as improved well-being, reduced isolation, community cohesion, stuff like that. So initially, this meant we were measuring far too many things and not always with a really clear internal rationale. So when we created the theory of change, it really was transformative because it gave us a real kind of structure about how we identify our long-term change we want to create, the intermediate outcomes that signal the progress towards that change, and also the specific outcomes that contribute to those outcomes, the outputs that contribute to those outcomes. And we kind of came across around those. We were able to get some funding to hire a consultant, not something that we would usually do as a small arts organization, but and they facilitated discussions with really the kind of key people, which were the staff, trustees, and really importantly, the volunteers and the participants as well. So we really were made sure that it was the participants themselves who had the voice in this. And we agreed on a set of impact themes that reflect our mission. The main ones being increased confidence, reduction in social isolation, and increased well-being. So the process allowed us to distinguish between what our core organizational outcomes are, which we measure consistently across all of our programs, and then the more project-specific outcomes, which we have to respond to particular communities or whatever the funder priorities are. So in essence, the theory of change became our kind of our anchor, really. The funders' frameworks, they still, of course, really matter, and we align with those, but now we interpret them through our own impact lens rather than having to reshape ourselves each time.
Fantastic, thank you. And I think for anyone who's not had a look at the ACTA website, and whilst watching this, I really love it. The first thing that really struck me about the organisation was having those kind of high-level outcomes that are common across your work, pulled from the theory of change, are really embedded in all of the ways that you talk about yourself. So I think it's such a great example for others to look at and learn from. So we've talked a lot about kind of what you want to understand and measure, the impacts and outcomes that you're looking for. I'm keen to now move this into the practical and ask about how you translated knowing what you wanted to measure into actual processes for measurement. Who wants to kick us off?
I'm happy to go.
Go for it.
And this is the real challenge, right? This is the real challenge for organizational capacity, for funding, but also how our tools for measurement help build and strengthen our relationships with those who we are working with. And there's some principles there which I think we have used, and also we are improving all the time. So how can we be creating really simple and repeatable set of measurements and core tools? How can we be building the processes for measurement actually into program design, it not being an add-on, but the evaluation process is really built in from the beginning, and it forms part of delivery. How can we be aligning systems so it means that some of these tools are really replicable and used by multiple different departments and teams within an organization. A couple of different examples I wanted to give. So we've mentioned, and Oliver's mentioned it as well, of sort of some of the legacies have been driven by what funders require and that information that has led to audience surveys, to participant surveys, using and building systems using Power BI to process a lot of that data to really understand how audiences engage with our work, participant levels of confidence, their sense of understanding, and their kind of confidence in performance or choreography. So we've really sort of lent into some of those online and digital surveys, which has been necessary, I suppose, to build to respond to our funder and reporting requirements. But now, through the process that we're going on to really build a sort of an updated organizational approach to impact, we're exploring other methods which really lean into our creative practice. We're testing these. So how can we be using dance as a method to measure how participants are feeling or experiencing a session? And reflecting on how our actual processes for measurement respond to and support the relationships that we're building with participants. We run a lot of dance activity for older participants. Actually, online forms to measure outcomes aren't the most accessible. So our learning engagement teams are exploring creative writing as a method through which to understand outcomes with older participants. I mentioned using dance methods, and we do a lot of work with families. So actually, how are we using, how are facilitators and practitioners using really simple tools of measuring kind of a sense of movement energy to understand how you're feeling at the beginning and end of a session? How are we exploring the use of interviews and case studies for those participants that we're working with over the longer term? So these are some of the tools and the measures that we're exploring. That's not to say we have an audience survey that goes out for every audience member after every show. That will stay. And we need to have those measures to and sometimes that balance needs to be struck based on capacity and everything else that teams are delivering. But a sense of how we are iteratively trying to improve some of those measures and how we're responding in a way that doesn't feel transactional, that doesn't feel extractive. That's definitely a work in progress. And the new framework that we are building and have been building through the work with Achates, we'll be implementing that iteratively. And that again helps us understand how we're building and translating what we want to measure into process. The learning engagement teams shared that when we can sort of launch a new approach perhaps at the beginning of the financial year, it will be implemented with project and program managers and across programs throughout the summer. So it's had some opportunity for sort of testing and learning before the start of the academic year, when lots of our programs with young people in schools, for instance, start. So it's a process of learning. And I think one of the important frameworks is your kind of system and data infrastructure, and that does also shape and inform the processes that you use, how we can be translating evaluation surveys and data into things like Testatura, so we're able to gather all of our data in one place, and that is guiding actually how we're approaching things as well.
Fantastic. Oliver, I know you mentioned creative evaluation as well. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, so knowing what we wanted to measure was one thing, but embedding it into sort of day-to-day practice really is another thing. And like Matira, we still have a long way to go on this and this aspect. But we began by mapping each desired outcome against practical evidence sources. So, for example, increase in confidence was through participant self-assessment surveys and facilitator observation and progression into new roles. Community connection is around attendance, consistency, and peer collaboration evidence and qualitative feedback. And skills development, for example, would be participant feedback and performance outcomes and recorded competencies. So we developed sort of simple proportionate tools to be able to gather the data. So we just registration and monitoring forms for quantitative reporting, short before after surveys, facilitator reflection templates, which is really important, and also some structured case study templates. And I think probably most importantly is the regular participant feedback conversation. So really just having those informal conversations. And we do use quite a few different creative techniques as well, but it's more really about embedding it into the sessions and into the work that we do. So it's not like you have to stop and say, okay, now we're going to evaluate it. It's actually, we're as practitioners, and as an organization, we're sort of listening all the time and we're kind of recording all the time. So it becomes far more informal. But a real key principle about the evaluation was that it had to be really workable within our program, because capacity is just a huge challenge. So we've really tried to avoid any academic tools and instead just really focused on just consistency and clarity. And we also tried to align a lot of our timelines for data collection. So obviously, like I've mentioned, we've got reporting cycles for Arts Council and Bristol City Council, and we're ensuring that data is gathered systemically rather than retrospectively, reducing the pressure on the reporting points and also improving that kind of data accuracy as well. So now I think most importantly, we're really positioning evaluation as part of our program design from the outset. So not seeing something that's added at the end. Not that we ever thought that was the way to do it. It was just through capacity and other, just day-to-day things. That's always what happened. It was an afterthought. So we're really trying to embed it into that planning. So new projects now include short impact planning stage where the outcomes, the evidence, methods, and responsibilities are kind of agreed before the delivery begins.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. I'm you've both kind of touched on it and about the role of sort of bringing in your colleagues and your teams and kind of building that confidence. I'd love to just dive into that a little bit further and ask a bit about how you've gone about building that confidence and expertise in something that might feel outside of people's day-to-day jobs, so that everyone can contribute to evaluation and learning. Oliver, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, much of the work in the community art setting is led by practitioners rather than evaluation specialists. But so as I mentioned, the big step forward for us was recruiting a specialist in impact measurement onto our board. And this brought a real kind of strategic expertise into our governance and provided both a challenge but also guidance at leadership level for me. To build confidence across the organization, we've shared examples of strong case studies and reflective practice. So we've looked at other organizations and seen what other people have done and what we liked. We've really looked at similar sized organizations to ourselves. And we now embed short evaluation discussions into our team meetings. Our team meetings every week are absolutely kind of vital for the running of the organization. But we now make sure that there's evaluation discussions in those meetings. And we also encourage our facilitators. So a lot of our work is delivered by core staff, but we also work a lot with freelancers. And seeing that the kind of the reflective notes and the evaluation we're asking them to do is part of their creative practice rather than an administrative burden. That it's something that that they have to do. And that's worked really well. And we've talked a lot about that we have a artist support and development program called Elevate, and we talked a lot to the participants of that within that program. So rather than expecting everyone to become an expert evaluator, we focus on the shared responsibility of the practitioners are out there gathering that frontline insights, and then we have the staff in the office. Not that there's huge amounts of us, but one or two of us who are mainly in that role, making sure that those data systems are really robust. Leadership, sort of interpreting that learning for using it for strategic use, and then the trustees really providing the oversight and the critical perspective. And this over time, it's this kind of building that collective confidence, but I think it will take time. But it's no longer viewed as an external requirement, but it's a tool that kind of really strengthens our works and sharpens our understanding of the difference that ACTA can make.
Yeah, that's great. I think there's across all of this, there's this idea of taking evaluation from being something separate and outside and therefore led by experts into something that is so embedded in our practice, and everyone has clear understanding of what that looks like for their role and lens. It's really, really interesting. Matira, how about you?
I feel like I'm learning a lot from you, Oliver, and I really love the sound of the approach that you're taking. And yeah, echo really similarly. And we'll delve into how we're building that confidence and capacity right across SAD as well shortly. But I just want to pick up on that last point around evaluation and impact evaluation being kind of this shared responsibility and not something sort of external. And I would caveat that by saying actually there's a huge amount of value in along that journey working with external organizations sometimes to help supercharge our approach or provide that space for critical reflection, provide that opportunity for different departments and board members and members of various committees to come together with participants, with artists at times as well. And so there's that balance between how we are leaning into some of the external capacity that's there, whether it's through Achates or whether it's through some of the other external organizations that our various teams have worked with to develop their frameworks. So having that extra support sometimes really helps us in embedding how evaluation is this shared responsibility and not an afterthought or an add-on, and how it can be really built into ongoing program and project delivery. I think we've seen real value in how practitioners and project and program managers are part of the journey in co-creating and co-designing these approaches. Everyone collectively understanding our practice around this, our intent, our purpose, and also helping to design and test tools and methods. Those who are closest to the delivery of some of this stuff, shaping actually how we are designing it, as Oliver has said, and those who are closest to kind of timeframes and planning and what works best with those that they're working with. And the last year, we're a really expanded organisation. We've opened a new theatre, and that has, driven some of the changes that we're making around impact. And having my additional role, but also having some other additional roles across the organisation to help drive this forward, and really bring together a lot of the data and insight and understanding that we've also seen as really beneficial to help build confidence and expertise, and sort of join up all the people that are working collectively and who are contributing to evaluation and learning.
Fantastic. I really like this sense of it's not just about kind of growing expertise in non-evaluation practice. It's bringing the expertise of non-evaluation practitioners to your evaluation design and kind of complementing, making it more effective, richer, more appropriate, workable, all of those things that you've talked about in the kind of principles, by drawing on kind of expertise and getting people bought into evaluation really early on in those design conversations. So Matira, a question for you specifically. I mentioned in your introduction that you bring expertise from outside of the cultural sector to your role. I was wondering, a year into it, what if anything, are you finding different in the cultural sector, and what can we learn from more mainstream charities?
Yeah, absolutely. So for a long time, I was working at Young Westminster Foundation and part of the growing Young People's Foundation network, really working to bring organisations from public, private, voluntary sectors together to really create and drive change alongside young Londoners and young people, and to sustain youth clubs and youth services. And I see a lot of really similar challenges here and across the culture sector to those I was experiencing working for a grant maker, a funder, but also a collective of grassroots organisations. Things like funder requirements, things like capacity, things like time and systems, how to make things sustainable. I was really struck throughout sort of my time learning from different organisations at Young Westminster, how we must be really mindful of our evaluation and impact approach not being extractive, and we're not commodifying stories for funding. We're not commodifying people's experiences for ensuring that our approach is meaningful and led by the change that we are all collectively wanting to see. And I learned a lot about how important trust is and the relational nature of impact and evaluation. How actually all of this work is around us working better together around whatever issue we're working on, and driving change. And we really need to understand our audiences and be building long-term relationships with them, and building trust within those relationships in order to learn and for there to be this sort of learning exchange. When I was working, predominantly with young people, actually we and I think that grassroots and youth services are really great at user-led approaches. And we were really fortunate as a new organisation. We were able to design something really new and be led by those closest to the issues, which led us to training young people as researchers, young people to lead some of this work, and for them to conduct peer-led evaluation. That's not always appropriate in different settings, but it really taught me a lot about how we build trust through evaluation methods to gain some of the most meaningful insight. And how that is translated, I think, into cultural organisations is I'm still learning and understanding that, and that works best in some settings and also not in others. I have also really reflected on some of the shared opportunities that exist, in particular around how we lean into our practice, how we lean into the creative methods that Oliver mentioned and that I mentioned earlier on, actually being informed by the audiences that we're working with in order to shape our approach to impact, how we are using dance as a dance organisation as a method through which we can understand and learn and drive impact. And I'm also really struck by the similarity of how much funders have a responsibility in this. So as a funder at Young Westminster, we were really mindful actually of how we the expectations that were built into kind of grant management processes and reporting, and actually how funders are really shaping the approach to evaluation and impact for organisations, how those how funders are able to support organisations but wider systems around impact. I think that's everything.
I mean, that was a lot. That was fantastic. I think it's a great reminder for any funders or people who work at funders represent here today that the decisions they make have huge ripples in terms of practice across the sector, and so where we can kind of simplifying and being really strategic in those decisions is important. And there's some fantastic guidance out there for funders setting up their monitoring, evaluation and learning practice. I think also I really love what the example you gave of kind of centering lived experience within evaluation and kind of bringing in the audiences themselves to lead some of that. I often come back to the Centre for Cultural Values evaluation principles, one of which is people-centred, and that idea of it's not always going to be appropriate, as you say, but bringing in different voices and different perspectives and shifting some of the power within evaluation is so important. Oliver, a question for you, if I may. I know last year you participated in an economic evaluation exercise led by Bristol City Council, who you mentioned as one of your main funders. I was wondering how useful you found it to have a headline measure of your economic value as an organisation compared to all of those other types of value that you measure against.
Yes, yeah, I think it is useful. It does feel useful to have an economic impact figure. Being able to quantify that is very useful for when we're bidding for tenders and commissions, which is something that we're at the moment trying to get more into, especially within the creative health arena. But the analysis that Bristol City Council did alongside BOP was for across many organisations in the city, so it was quite generic. But so what we're doing is we're trying to build on that and actually create something ourselves, which is much more bespoke to ACTA. And that would be with input from the trustee who I've mentioned, who's on our board, and the organisation Wave Hill, who they work for. But I would say it's not we haven't used it that much, but I would say that it allows us to speak in a language that resonates strongly with local authority stakeholders and across sector partners, and it strengthens advocacy conversations, particularly in times of constrained public spending. But I think really importantly for us, it reinforces the idea that community theatre or participatory arts, it's not just about social value, but it contributes economically through generating local spends, supporting employment, and contributing to placemaking. So we're very careful not to let an economic value eclipse the other forms of impact, and the kind of the richness and of the personal transformation, the voice and belonging can't really be reduced to a financial proxy. But the economic measure is helpful as an addition, I think, so a complementary lens rather than a replacement for social and cultural value.
Yeah, I really like that idea of using it to sort of subvert expectations about the type of value that community and participatory theatre can deliver. I suppose I'm slightly biased in asking the question in thinking about, we often get people coming to us who want that economic measure beyond anything else, and they see that as the kind of silver bullet that's going to solve all of their funding and advocacy challenges. And I think you put it really well there. It's a useful thing to have, and it does speak the language of money to money sometimes, but also it shouldn't be seen in isolation from those other points. And we were really glad to see, I mentioned in my introduction some changes recently to the Treasury Green Book, and one of the things they've changed within there is moving away from this idea of just economic value to this more balanced picture, holistic idea of the value that you can demonstrate, and potentially some of those more robust economic evaluations only being used in the biggest kind of projects or pieces of work. So I was happy to see that direction of travel, but I also think it's really useful to think quite deliberately about where that is useful for us as a sector. I'm conscious of time, and I could chat to you guys about evaluation all day, but I think I'm going to bring us to a close with one final question. So we've talked a lot about kind of the different purposes of measurement and how you use that in different elements of your work. And so I was wondering if I could ask you each for an example of how you've used the information that you gather. So maybe Oliver, I'll ask you for an example of how you've used it for communications and income generation, and then Matira for board meetings and strategic decision making. Cool. Oliver, you first.
Yeah. So from a comms perspective, our evaluation material is really invaluable. As much as the kind of quantitative data strengthens the funding bids, particularly with our core funders. Robust reporting is part of our funding agreement, but clear outcome evidence also supports the applications to trusts and foundations who increasingly require those examples of impact. But the qualitative insight, I think, is really the most valuable. Those participant quotes, the case studies, the stories of change, they really kind of form the backbone of our external communications. And those sort of narratives really, they bring the statistics to life. They strengthen our donor engagement, and they support our advocacy conversations. And they definitely enhance our marketing and our audience development. So it's that combination of the hard data and the human stories that kind of proves it's far more persuasive than either of them alone, I think.
Yeah, the evaluation mantra I always come back to is no numbers without stories, no stories without numbers. Like you have to have them both together. I think that's so important. Matira, an example from decision making, if I may.
Yes, of course. And I think they're so interlinked, right? And I think the example that I wanted to share was some of the decision making we made when we were opening Sadler's Wells East, so a new venue. Really being clear in the audience development goals we had around improving young audiences and access audiences for Sadler's Wells East, and actually how we're able to really use data, qualitative and quantitative, to really understand kind of those different demographic groups and the local area as well, to really understand the change that we wanted to see, to identify two different sort of target demographics, or their name. We worked with the external agency on this, and we really wanted to really really get into and understand those groups, and the data that we were able to gather then shaped the decision making of both our board, but also then our teams and our approach to opening that new venue. But it also, similarly to Oliver, has shaped then our external communications, how we're able to craft messages and campaigns that specifically speak to those target groups and help drive that change we want to see around access to dance. And we've been able to then really continue to build that evidence and insight a year on from the opening of Sadler's Wells East in understanding attendance and participation, and it continues to drive learning and decision making. And I think that's what's really important around the governance structures, right? We've got various different committees that also sit under the board, and they hold us to account, and they are accountable for our evaluation frameworks, and they become a sense of governance, but also learning, and a sense of how collectively as an organisation we're able to take the quantitative and the qualitative insight and learn and develop and make different choices as a result of what we're hearing, and that being a really ongoing but collective process. Things like opening a new venue, a new theatre, really supercharge that and drive that, but it doesn't just end with the opening. It must continue as we develop our audience strategy or our work with communities over the coming years.
Yeah, I mean, there's no point doing this work at all if it's not driving us to different choices and different ways of working. And I love your example. That's probably one of the biggest decisions that's been made in the culture sector, the development of South as Wales East, but that trickles down to every layer of decision making and every element of your structure is so important.
The final thing I just wanted to jump in and
Yeah.
add around that, sorry, I'm conscious of time as well, is actually
No,
how our board and how committees and how the sharing of everything that Oliver and I have spoken about today, we are also providing stories for our key ambassadors, right? And how we are doing that in a way which is most engaging and most translatable. And we're considering how we're telling that story for different audiences, whether it's the Treasury, whether it's health, whether it's education, whether it's local authorities, actually how we're sharing that insight with our board and our trustees, who are also able to translate and share that information themselves. So thinking about how we do that in a way which is not only telling the story, not only leading to impact, not only driving change, but is also leading to some of the most kind of engaged ways of driving support.
fantastic. I think that takes us back to what we were saying right at the start around having these coherent narratives and allowing people to kind of buy into that. So it's a great place to draw us to a close. Thank you both so much for sharing your time and expertise. It's been enormously interesting for me, and I'm sure for everyone watching us. Thank you to those of you who have tuned in today to watch this Achates Inspires. If this has prompted any thoughts for you about your approach to impact measurement, how you ensure your compliance with the new SORP guidelines, or how you could just do things a bit differently, then do explore the modules on evaluation on Achates Community, or get in touch with me to discuss how you might apply this to your work. I think that's everything. So I will say again, a huge thank you to Matira and Oliver for joining us, and see you all next time. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.